The morning fog was still clinging to the pavement on 8th Street when the black girl emerged from the shadows. Gray hoodie pulled up over wild curly hair, denim jacket 2 sizes too big, and eyes swimming with tears, wide, terrified, scanning the sidewalk like a hunted animal. She halted right in front of him. The man who made the police look the other way. The man the streets whispered about as the silent dragon. He was just closing the door of his armored luxury sedan when she reached out, grabbing the fabric of his cashmere coat. "Mister," she cracked, her voice barely audible over the city hum. "The bad man is watching. Can you walk me to school? I don't feel safe." The air on the block seemed to vanish. His 3 bodyguards stiffened, hands hovering near their waistbands. Even the traffic noise seemed to fade into a terrified silence. No one approached Han Song-woo without an appointment. Men approached him for loans they couldn't pay, for territory disputes, or to beg for their lives. But never for protection. Never for safety. Han didn't signal his men to remove her. Instead, he crouched down slowly, his pristine suit straining against the movement. "Who is watching you, little one?" Cheryl trembled, her small finger raising to point toward the chain-link fence across the street. A figure stood there, leaning casually, a snake tattoo visible on his neck. Waiting. Cheryl knew the rules of 8th Street better than she knew her multiplication tables. Rule number 1 was to be invisible. But lately, invisibility was impossible. The radiator in apartment 4B had died a week ago, leaving the air as cold as the concrete outside, but the chill in Cheryl's bones wasn't from the weather. It was from the hacking coughing fits that shook her grandmother's frail frame every night. Nana Maria had worked her hands to the bone for 40 years, scrubbing floors in office buildings downtown, only to be left behind by a city that didn't care. Now, the asthma and the arthritis had conspired to keep her trapped in her armchair, wrapped in 3 distinct blankets, unable to make the walk to the elementary school. "Run fast, baby," Nana would wheeze each morning, pressing a trembling kiss to Cheryl's forehead. "Don't stop for nobody. Eyes forward." But running wasn't enough when the predator was patient. For 3 weeks, the man with the snake tattoo, Razor, had been there. At first, he was just a shadow near the playground. Then he was a voice calling out, "Hey, Curly," from the alleyway, the sound sliding over her skin like oil. Yesterday, he had been waiting right at the school gate. Cheryl had tried to tell her teacher, clutching the woman's skirt in a panic as the bell rang. "He's there again," she'd cried, pointing a shaking finger. But Mrs. Gable had peeled Cheryl's fingers away, sighing about active imaginations and needing to get to the faculty meeting. The system was a high wall, and Cheryl was too small to climb it. She had waved at a patrol car 2 days ago, but the officers hadn't even turned their heads, their windows rolled up tight against the neighborhood they were supposed to protect. To them, she was just another kid in a gray hoodie on a block where trouble was the weather forecast. She was entirely alone. That morning, when she stepped out of her building, Razor was there. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was leaning against the rusted chain-link fence across the street, picking his teeth, watching her with a hunger that made her knees knock together. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto hers. She froze. There was nowhere to run, the block was empty, the shops shuttered tight against the morning frost. Then, the black car appeared. It slid to the curb like a shark in dark water, interrupting the predator's path. Han Song-woo. She knew him from the fearful whispers in the bodega. The silent dragon. The adults said he was a bad man, a man who took things and left silence behind. But looking at Razor's widening grin, Cheryl realized something profound for a 7-year-old. Sometimes you need a monster to scare away the boogeyman. She didn't see a criminal in the expensive suit, she saw a shield. Swallowing the scream building in her throat, she pushed off the curb and ran toward the one thing on the street scarier than the man hunting her. Han Song-woo lived his life by a geometry of absolute precision. His suit was tailored in Milan, his car armored in Berlin, and his schedule calibrated to the second. In his world, emotions were liabilities, and chaos was a disease to be excised. Standing there on the damp pavement of 8th Street, he felt the disorder radiating from the girl trembling in his shadow like static interference on a clear line. She was a mess of untied laces and unchecked fear, a glaring error in his perfectly ordered morning. He looked past the girl's terrified curls to the figure leaning against the chain-link fence. The man was everything Han despised. Slouching posture, garish tattoos that screamed for attention, a cigarette hanging loosely from his lip. Razor. Han knew the dossier, though he had never deigned to meet the man. A bottom feeder who trafficked in misery and noise, operating on the fringes where the syndicates usually turned a blind eye. But 8th Street wasn't the fringes. It was a border, and borders required respect. Razor smirked, a jagged, ugly expression that challenged Han directly. The predator didn't retreat, he shifted his weight, hand drifting toward his pocket. The arrogance was breathtaking. To hunt a child in the open was barbaric, to do it in front of Han Song-woo was suicidal. It was a direct insult, a declaration that the street codes Han enforced meant nothing to this chaotic upstart. Han felt the eyes of his bodyguards boring into his back. They were waiting for the signal to dismantle the threat, to drag the man into an alley and restore the silence. But violence here, now, would be messy. It would bring police, questions, and noise. Han hated noise. He looked back down at the girl. Her eyes held the same desperate plea he had seen 1,000 times in debtors' dens, but this was different. She owed him nothing. She simply believed he was powerful enough to stop the monsters. It is not kindness, he told himself, the thought cold and sharp as a scalpel. It is maintenance. You do not let rats scurry across your doorstep. You do not let the weeds choke the garden. To leave the girl to this animal would be to admit that he had lost control of his own territory. Protecting her was simply a way to remind the city who actually owned the pavement she walked on. Stand up, Han said, his voice soft but possessing the weight of iron. He rose to his full height, smoothing the crease in his trousers, and extended a hand that had signed death warrants without trembling. We will walk. He saw the shock register on his head of security's face, but Han didn't explain. He didn't need to. He took Cheryl's small, rough hand in his manicured grip. He wasn't just walking a child to school, he was walking to war, and the first shot would be fired with absolute silence. They moved down 8th Street like a glitch in the city's matrix. On the left, the sharp, obsidian silhouette of Han Song-woo, cut from Italian wool and silence. On the right, the small, trembling figure of Cheryl, wrapped in a pilled gray hoodie and denim that had seen too many wash cycles. His hand, manicured and deadly, enveloped hers, which was rough and sticky with the residue of fear. It was an image that defied every unwritten law of the district, the untouchable foreign kingpin and the invisible neighborhood child, walking in lockstep against the morning wind. The silence that accompanied them was heavier than the traffic noise it displaced. As they passed the corner bodega, the metal shutters rattled up, revealing old Mr. Henderson. He froze, his hands halfway through stacking newspapers, his eyes widening as he took in the impossible sight. Further down, Mrs. Kim paused in the doorway of her dry cleaners, the cigarette dropping from her lips. Usually, these two sides of the street existed in parallel dimensions, brushing past each other without acknowledging shared humanity. But today, the Korean grandmother and the black elder stared at the same point, their collective breath held in a suspended moment of awe. Han felt the weight of their gazes. He kept his chin high, his expression unreadable behind his dark sunglasses, but his grip on Cheryl's hand remained firm, a constant transmission of safety. He walked with a deliberate, rhythmic cadence, forcing the girl to match his stride, turning her frantic scuttle into a dignified march. Head up, he murmured, barely moving his lips. Do not look at the ground. You are not the one who should be hiding. Cheryl sniffed, wiping her nose on her sleeve, and lifted her chin. Across the street, the effect was immediate. Razor's crew, usually so loud and sprawling in their intimidation, seemed to shrink. The man with the snake tattoo had pushed off the fence, his posture aggressive, but as Han drew closer, the predator's bravado evaporated. Razor's eyes darted from Han's stoic face to the three large men trailing 10 paces behind him, Han's shadows, moving with the lethal grace of Dobermans. There was no shouting match. No weapons were drawn. There was only the crushing pressure of Han's presence. Razor took a step back, then another, his boots scuffing on the concrete in a clumsy retreat. He mumbled something to his underlings, and like smoke clearing in a stiff breeze, they dissolved into the alleyways, leaving the sidewalk open. The threat hadn't just been neutralized, it had been embarrassed. For the first time in her life, Cheryl walked down her own block not as prey, but as royalty, shielded by the darkest shadow in the city. Han returned to the sanctuary of his armored sedan, the heavy door sealing out the noise of the street with a dull thud. The engine purred to life, vibrating through the leather seats, but Han did not signal the driver to move. Instead, he pulled a sleek black phone from his coat pocket and dialed a number that didn't exist in any public directory. "The tenement on 8th, he said, his voice flat. "Who holds the mortgage?" A pause. "Buy it. Today. Under the Shell Company." He watched through the tinted glass as Cheryl disappeared into the school building, her backpack bouncing. And the grandmother in 4B. Clear her debts. All of them. Medical, rent, utilities. Mark it as a clerical error or a lottery win. Just make sure she never worries about money again. He hung up before there could be an acknowledgement. It was a precise, surgical strike against the chaos that allowed men like Razor to thrive. Poverty was the crack in the pavement where weeds grew. Han was simply pouring concrete. He signaled his team to install cameras, eyes that never blinked, on the lampposts facing the school and the apartment block. By noon, 8th Street would be the most surveilled blind spot in the city. Just as the car shifted into gear, a small fist rapped on the window. Han lowered the glass an inch. Cheryl stood on her tiptoes, breathless. She didn't say a word, just shoved a folded piece of lined notebook paper through the crack. Her eyes, no longer terrified, held a fierce, childish gratitude. Then, she turned and sprinted back toward the safety of the school doors. Han unfolded the paper. It was a crayon drawing, hasty and crude. A tall, black rectangle represented him, standing next to a smaller, gray smudge. A yellow sun, impossibly bright, hung over them. It was garbage, the kind of debris he usually had his cleaners incinerate. But Han didn't crumple it. He stared at the waxy lines for a long moment, feeling a strange, unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Slowly, deliberately, he folded the drawing and tucked it into the inner breast pocket of his jacket, right next to his heart, shielding it behind $5,000 worth of Italian silk. "Boss," Lieutenant Park said from the front seat, his eyes watching Han in the rearview mirror with guarded concern. "We have a meeting with the Triad in 20 minutes. This detour. Razor will not take this lightly. He will see it as a territory grab." Park paused, the unspoken question hanging in the recycled air. "Is this good for business?" Han looked out at the gray street, the ghost of the little girl's warmth still lingering on his palm. "Business requires order, Park," Han replied, his voice dropping to a temperature that frosted the air between them. "And I am tired of the noise." But as the car pulled away, Han knew the lieutenant was right. He had just bought a war with a drawing of the sun. The truce of 8th Street lasted exactly 48 hours. Razor, stung by the humiliation of his retreat, didn't wait for darkness this time. He chose the bleeding edge of the afternoon, while the sun was still scraping against the brick tenements and Cheryl was drawing hopscotch squares in pink chalk on the sidewalk. She felt safe now, a dangerous illusion in a city that remembered everything. A rusted sedan screeched to the curb, mounting the sidewalk with a grinding crunch of metal. The door flew open, and one of Razor's lieutenants, a man built like a refrigerator with knuckles tattooed to read hate, lunged for her. He didn't speak. He just grabbed the hood of her gray sweatshirt, jerking her backward off her feet. Cheryl screamed, a high, piercing sound that usually signaled the neighborhood to close its blinds and turn up the television. But the neighborhood had seen the dragon walk with the lamb. The old rules of mind your business had been rewritten in Italian wool and silence. Mr. Henderson didn't lock the bodega door. Instead, the 60-year-old grocer vaulted over his fruit stand, wielding a heavy wooden crate of yams like a battering ram. He slammed it into the kidnapper's spine with a roar that sounded nothing like a shopkeeper. "Not today," he bellowed. The attacker stumbled, his grip on Cheryl loosening just enough for her to scramble away. He turned, reaching for his waistband, but he never got the gun out. Mrs. Kim, the tiny woman from the dry cleaners who barely reached the man's chest, stepped out and unleashed a stream of pepper spray directly into his eyes, screaming curses in Korean that needed no translation. Suddenly, they were everywhere. The stoop-sitters, the mechanics, the mothers watching from windows, they poured onto the street, forming a human wall between the girl and the car. They weren't trained fighters, they were a chaotic mess of fists, handbags and rage, but they were united. The kidnapper, blinded and battered by a dozen hands, flailed backward, falling against his car door. Then came the precision. A matte black SUV drifted around the corner, silent as a shark. It didn't screech, it simply arrived. Two of Han's shadows stepped out. They didn't run. They walked with terrifying calm through the parting crowd of neighbors. The residents stepped back, not in fear, but in deference, leaving a clear path to the groaning man on the ground. One of Han's men nodded to Mr. Henderson, a sharp, respectful dip of the chin that acknowledged the grocer as a soldier in the same army. Then, without a word, they hoisted the kidnapper off the pavement and threw him into the back of the SUV like a sack of laundry. The message was clear as the black vehicle pulled away. The mafia and the street were no longer separate entities. They were a singular, jagged line of defense, and Razor had just run straight into the teeth of it. Razor didn't retreat to lick his wounds, he retreated to sharpen his knives. The humiliation on 8th Street had curdled into a cold, venomous rage. If the neighborhood wanted to play soldier, he would remind them what a slaughter looked like. Veterans Park was 3 blocks away, technically neutral ground, a patch of cracked asphalt and rusted swings where the territory lines blurred. At 5:15 p.m., it was full of laughter. Mateo was kicking a soccer ball against the graffiti-stained wall, Emily was pushing her little brother on the swings, quiet Malik was reading a comic book on a bench. They were the children of the peace Han thought he had bought. The van didn't even slow down. It jumped the curb, tearing through the chain-link fence with a metallic shriek. 4 men spilled out, moving with the terrifying speed of desperate violence. There were no neighbors here to throw crates, no Korean grandmothers with pepper spray. There was only the scream of tires and the shrill, confused cries of children. In less than 60 seconds, Mateo, Emily, and Malik were gone. The only thing left behind was a deflated soccer ball and the heavy, suffocating silence of a playground suddenly devoid of life. Across town, in the penthouse office of the Golden Imperial Club, Han Song-woo was pouring a glass of whiskey. The city lights below looked like jewels, orderly and distant. The intercom buzzed, shattering the calm. "Package for you, Sejangnam," his guard announced, his voice tight. "No return address." Courier said it was urgent. Han didn't flinch. He set his glass down, the amber liquid trembling slightly. "Bring it." The box was wrapped in brown butcher paper, damp at the corners. When Han cut the twine with a letter opener, the smell hit him first, iron and rot. Inside, nestled in dirty straw, were 3 objects, a small, mud-stained sneaker, a pink hair ribbon, and a pair of broken reading glasses. But it was the photograph beneath them that made Han's blood turn to ice. It was a grainy telephoto shot of him holding Cheryl's hand from that morning, taken from a rooftop. Smeared across his own face in the photo, thick and crimson and still wet, was a message scrawled in blood: "You watch her." Who watches them? Han stared at the red letters. The whiskey glass in his hand shattered, slicing into his palm. He didn't feel the cut. He didn't look at the blood dripping from his own hand onto the pristine mahogany desk. He only felt the crushing weight of the realization that his act of redemption had just condemned 3 innocents to hell. The war he had tried to buy his way out of had just arrived at his doorstep, and it was demanding a price he wasn't sure he could pay. The silence in the penthouse was no longer a luxury. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. Lieutenant Park stood by the desk, his eyes fixed on the blood dripping from Han's clenched fist, mingling with the mess on the mahogany. He didn't offer a bandage. In their line of work, some wounds had to bleed. "It is a classic pincer move, Sejangnam," Park said, his voice steady but urgent. "Razor knows he cannot beat us in a straight fight. He wants you to react emotionally. He wants you to send our soldiers into the tenements where his traps are waiting. If we move on him now, the triads will see we are distracted. The Russians will move on the docks. We lose the shipping lanes by morning." Han didn't answer. He was staring at the small, mud-caked sneaker on his desk. It belonged to a child who had probably never seen the ocean, let alone a shipping lane. "Cut the line," Park urged, stepping closer. We double security on 8th Street for the girl, Cheryl. We keep our word to her. But these others, they are civilians. Casualties of the city. If you go to war for them, you burn down the empire you spent 20 years building. Is that a fair trade? It was the sensible choice. The logical choice. It was the choice the old Han Song-woo would have made without a second heartbeat. To survive as a king, one had to be willing to sacrifice pawns. Han reached into his inner breast pocket with his uninjured hand. He pulled out the folded piece of notebook paper. The edges were sharp against his fingertips. He unfolded it next to the carnage on his desk. The crude crayon drawing, the black rectangle and the yellow sun, sat in stark contrast to the blood-smeared photograph of his own face. The girl had drawn him as a protector. Razor had painted him as a plague. You ask if it is a fair trade, Han said softly. He looked at the yellow sun, drawn with such heavy pressure the wax had clumped on the paper. He thought of the terrifying trust in Cheryl's eyes, and then he thought of the terror that must be in Mateo's, Emily's, and Malik's eyes right now in some dark basement. My empire is built on fear, Park. But a man who allows children to be harvested to save his profit margin is not a king. He is just a manager of a slaughterhouse. Han picked up the drawing and slid it back into his pocket, close to his heart. Then he wrapped his bleeding hand in a silk handkerchief, pulling the knot tight with his teeth. Burn it, Han said, his voice cold and final. Park blinked. The evidence. No. Han turned to the window, looking out at the city that thought it knew him. The rule book. Call every captain. Empty the warehouses. I don't care about the docks. Tonight, we are not businessmen. We are the consequences. The fluorescent lights of the St. Jude Community Center buzzed overhead, a sickly yellow hum that grated against raw nerves. The room was packed with folding chairs and frantic parents, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and sharp, acrid sweat. When the double doors swung open, the cacophony of sobbing and shouting was severed instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical. Han Song-woo stepped into the room. He was alone, having ordered his security detail to wait outside, a suicide move in any other context. He walked down the center aisle, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the scuffed linoleum. Every eye fixed on him was a weapon. These weren't the deferential looks of shopkeepers. These were the glares of mothers who had nothing left to lose. You have some nerve, a voice cracked through the quiet. It was Maria, Mateo's mother. She stood up, her face swollen from crying, pointing a trembling finger at the most dangerous man in the city. You come here to watch. My boy is gone because of you. Because you wanted to play hero for a day. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, ugly and rising. A man near the front, Malik's father, stepped forward, fists clenched at his sides. Get out, he spat. Before we carry you out. Han didn't flinch. He didn't signal for backup. He simply stopped in the middle of the room, looking at the faces distorted by the same agony he had seen in the mirror only an hour ago. He looked at the banner above the stage that read Unity in Community, now mocking them all. You are right, Han said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the back of the hall. I threw a stone into the water, and your children were caught in the ripple. I cannot undo the past. I cannot give you back the hours you have spent in hell. He slowly unwrapped the silk handkerchief from his hand. The cut from the broken glass was still fresh, a jagged red line across his palm. He held it up, not as a threat, but as testimony. The room went still, watching the blood well up. But I know where the monsters live, Han continued, his gaze locking with Maria's. And I know how to kill them. He took a step closer to the grieving parents, lowering his hand so the blood dripped once onto the gray floor, a visceral, binding contract. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am asking for your trust for one night, Han stated, his voice turning into cold steel. I pledge this on my own blood and on my honor, which is all I have left. I will bring Mateo, Emily, and Malik home to you. He paused, looking at each parent individually. Or I will not return at all. The promise hung in the air, absolute and terrifying. It wasn't a politician's vow, It was a death sentence, either for Razor or for Han himself. Maria looked at the man in the black suit, searching for the lie, but found only a terrifying resolve. Slowly, she nodded. And in that nod, the pact was sealed. The dragon belonged to them now. The raid did not begin with a shout, but with a ripple of silence that started on the corner of 8th and Main. It was a terrifying symphony of two worlds colliding. Han's elite enforcers, moving with the fluid lethality of specters, synchronized their breach with the text messages of neighborhood lookouts perched on rooftops and fire escapes. The teenage boy on the bike signaled the bakery owner, who signaled the black SUV. The eyes of the street guided the hands of the syndicate. Razor's stronghold was a dilapidated warehouse by the old rail yards, a monument to decay. He expected the police, or perhaps a rival gang crashing through the front door. He did not expect the lights to cut out simultaneously, plunged into darkness by a hack from Han's tech specialist. He did not expect the windows to shatter inward, not from stones, but from flashbang grenades. Han moved through the smoke like a wraith, his handgun an extension of his will. His men swept the floor with surgical efficiency, dropping Razor's thugs before they could raise their weapons. There was no chaotic brawling tonight, there was only the cold, hard math of superior force. When Han kicked open the door to the inner office, he found Razor trying to scramble out a window. Razor froze, looking back. He didn't see a businessman in a suit. He saw the Reaper. Han didn't speak. He simply pistol-whipped the trafficker across the jaw, sending him crumbling to the floor, his reign of terror ending not with a roar, but with a whimper. "This city has new rules," Han whispered to the unconscious man. "And you broke them all." Moments later, the heavy steel door of the storage room was torched open. Inside, huddled together on dirty mattresses, were Mateo, Emily, and Malik. Terrified, but alive. When Han stepped into the light, holstering his weapon, Malik looked up. He didn't scream. He recognized the man from the stories. The dragon had come. The sun rose over 8th Street the next morning, burning off the fog. The neighborhood was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, a peace born of victory, not fear. Cheryl R. Moran stepped out of her building. Her gray hoodie was clean, her shoelaces tied tight. She looked across the street at the chain-link fence. It was empty. There were no shadows waiting for her. She didn't run today. She walked. Half a block away, parked inconspicuously near the corner, the black armored sedan sat idling. Inside, Han Song-woo watched through the tinted glass. He touched the breast pocket of his jacket, where a crinkled crayon drawing of a yellow sun still rested. He would not walk her today. She didn't need him to hold her hand anymore. She walked with the confidence of a girl who knew the monsters were gone. But as she turned the corner toward the school, she paused and looked back at the black car. She offered a small, shy wave. Han didn't wave back. He was the silent dragon, after all. But for the first time in 20 years, he allowed himself a smile. He signaled the driver, and the car slipped silently into traffic, a guardian returning to the shadows, always watching.